The Age of Iron conjures up images of a truly epic story. Iron has been an unceasing source of wealth and industry since the art of smelting iron and the techniques of iron manufacture were first developed in Eastern Asia Minor some 3,500 years ago. It was an epoch-making discovery. Within 500 years, by about 900 BC, it had spread to India and 300 years later to China. At about this time, it reached the Celtic peoples of Central and Northern Europe, and in another 500 years, it was in use in Africa, south of the Sahara. The Age of Iron had begun, an era which lasted almost to our own day. What started out as a development enabling early peoples to arm themselves with iron weapons and farmers to make more efficient tools for tilling the soil led many centuries later to a situation in which iron and coal became the sinews of industry until their place was taken by steel, electricity, and oil. Looking back from the perspective of the 20th century, the discovery of iron appears momentous, almost a turning point in world history, having its effect in different ways and at different times in different parts of the world. The earliest civilizations of the great river valleys, the Tigris and Euphrates, the Nile, the Indus, and the Yellow River in China, had not known the art of smelting iron. They had used copper and tin to make bronze weapons and ornaments, and many exquisite examples of this art have survived. This is why they are sometimes called the Bronze Age empires. In some areas, copper and its alloy bronze were worked for 2,000 years before men learned to make iron. Although iron ores are extremely common, much more so than copper and tin, the technology of producing iron was much more difficult than the smelting of copper. Only certain types of ores would yield iron under early technology. The minimum smelting temperature is much higher for iron than for copper or tin. The smelting of tin and the pouring of it into simple molds is relatively straightforward, as in this modern reconstruction. This process has remained the same in essence right down to the present day, and modern foundries working in bronze still follow similar procedures. This is the lost wax technique, which is still used in some modern bronze foundries, in which wax is poured into a mold which has already taken the shape of the object to be formed. The molten metal is then poured into the mold to displace the wax, so taking the form of the object to be created. When the metal has cooled and solidified, the mold is slowly chipped away and the bronze revealed. Iron cannot be poured into molds like copper or bronze. It has to be further worked by a smith, and according to the furnace conditions, the quality of the iron may vary considerably, from soft iron unsuitable for weapons to a form of steel difficult to work. The modern-day working of iron is the last style in a long process that takes us back some 3,500 years to when iron was first produced. Initially, it was something of a rarity, but soon it began to be smelted from ores in Eastern Asia Minor, and iron swords and even iron statues were mentioned in Hittite texts. The population upheaval in Asia Minor around 1200 BC helped spread knowledge of the use of iron throughout the Middle East and then farther afield. But iron weapons still remained largely the prerogative of royalty and the nobility. It was not until about 900 BC that iron daggers became widely available for the Assyrian army. But by 700 BC, as iron technology improved, iron was beginning to be used for a variety of tools and utensils. The period leading up to the advent of iron had been a long period of conflict. By about 2000 BC, the earliest civilizations in China, India, Mesopotamia, and Egypt, like small islands in a sea of barbarism, were under assault everywhere. From the very beginning, the wealth and luxury of their cities, particularly in Mesopotamia, were an irresistible temptation to the surrounding tribesmen, eager to plunder their riches. One of the characteristics of these marauders was their mobility. The horse was first domesticated in the steppe lands between Europe and Asia, in what is now the Ukraine. Prowess on horseback is still important to these Mongolian riders today, just as it was important to the tribes and peoples 4,000 years ago, whose success depended on their ability at fighting whilst moving swiftly on horseback. By 2000 BC, the horse had spread to Europe and the Near East. The Hurrians, one of the horse-using groups, established a powerful kingdom based on northwest Mesopotamia, which reached its peak at about 1500 BC. They developed a fast horse-drawn chariot, and their contacts with Assyria, Babylonia, and Egypt spread its use throughout the Middle East. The chariot was sometimes used in war for rapid transport to and from the fighting, and sometimes for sport, as recorded in this gold Phoenician dish. About 1200 BC, the advent of swift-moving cavalry brought about a revolution in warfare. Now whole tribes and peoples were mobilized. When these mounted horsemen began to acquire iron weapons, they proved to be an unstoppable force, with a striking power superior to anything an infantry army, however well organized, could attain. The horse, the chariot, the mounted cavalrymen, the gradual spread of iron weapons, all this added up to a package of technological contrasts which separate the Bronze Age of 2000 BC from the Iron Age of the last 1,000 years before Christ. In the West, the Minoan civilization of Crete was overrun about 1450 BC by invaders from the mainland, the Mycenaeans. And they in turn were overrun some 200 years later by a wave of barbarian invaders from the north, armed with iron weapons, probably the Dorians. The Minoan capital Knossos was sacked. So also were Mycenae and other walled citadels in the Peloponnese. The flourishing early civilization of the Aegean was blotted out. Writing and many other arts disappeared. In the 12th century BC, a dark night descended over the whole Mediterranean region until the rise of the great city-states like Troy, Sparta, Athens, and Corinth some 500 years later. In India, the Indus Valley civilization suffered the same fate. About 1500 BC, it was overrun by barbarian tribesmen from the north, probably invaders from the Iranian plateau beyond the great mountain range of the Hindu Kush, who called themselves Aryans, a branch of the same Indo-European family of peoples whose western branches invaded Greece. The Indus civilization disappeared, and in its place a primitive new society gradually took shape in the Ganges Valley. By about 400 BC, the single great kingdom of Magadha was in existence, with a magnificent new capital at Pataliputra, modern Patna, which controlled the richest iron ore deposits and dominated the Ganges trade routes. This was the nucleus of the first great Indian empire, founded after 322 BC by Chandragupta Maurya and extended by his grandson Asoka, who brought nearly the whole of the Indian peninsula under his rule. Even Egypt, largely protected by desert, did not escape the impact of mounted cavalry. Invaders from Asia, known as the Hyksos, took possession of the delta and the lower Nile Valley and ruled there for over a century until they were expelled in 1570 BC. But it was Mesopotamia, the richest prize of all, that experienced the most persistent assault. Here, two different groups of barbarians converged on the civilized centers: the Semitic-speaking people from the Syrian desert and the Indo-European Hittites, infiltrating across the Caucasus and from the west of the Black Sea. The result was a constant rise and fall of empires as one barbarian tribe after another ousted or conquered its rivals. Hurrians from the highlands of Armenia, Kassites from the Zagros Mountains, the Hittites from Asia Minor, Chaldeans from the Arabian Desert, Aramaeans, Mitanni, Medes, and Persians. Among these, two great empires finally emerged, those of the Hittites and the Assyrians. The Assyrians were ruthless conquerors and successful empire builders. By 650 BC, their empire, with its capital at Nineveh, included the whole of Mesopotamia, Syria, Palestine, and Egypt, as far south as Thebes. It had iron weapons, a disciplined army, and an efficient bureaucracy. But the Medes and Scythian hordes finally brought down the Assyrian Empire, and in 612 BC, a coalition of enemies destroyed Nineveh and ended forever the role of Assyria in history. Its place was taken first by imperial Medes, and then by Persia under Cyrus the Great, who laid the foundation for another great imperial structure, the Achaemenid Empire, which was to flourish mightily until Alexander the Great burnt its capital, Persepolis, to the ground in 330 BC. The advent of iron had witnessed a long and turbulent era. But this period also had a positive place in the human story. The area of civilization was gradually increasing. Between 2000 and 1000 BC, a series of communities arose along the riverbanks and coastal plains of Southeast Asia, all the way from Bengal to southern China. Although the cultural legacy of the Bronze Age civilizations of Crete and the Indus Valley was swamped, in Mesopotamia and Egypt, civilization survived, with only local and temporary setbacks. The barbarians who took power there wanted to enjoy what they had conquered, not to destroy it. The Assyrians regarded themselves as heirs and custodians of Sumerian and Babylonian civilization. Many Assyrian royal inscriptions were written not in Assyrian, but in Standard Babylonian. They collected and preserved the literature of the Mesopotamian past, copied Mesopotamian art, worshipped the old gods like Ninhursag, the goddess of fertility. Thus, Western Asia, or the Near East, continued to be preeminent right down through the centuries, until Alexander the Great's invasion and the destruction of the Persian Empire in 330 BC. Furthermore, the discovery of iron and the rapid spread of its use opened up enormous new possibilities for progress. Not only did it provide weapons for marauders, but it also provided far more efficient tools for farmers and tillers of the soil. China experienced the Iron Revolution later than in the West. Cast iron technology was the first form of iron working introduced, and so from the beginning, mass production of multiple castings was possible. Hence, iron founding became big business, run by the state and industrialists from around 300 BC onwards. The early Bronze Age civilizations of the Shang had been confined to the light, easily worked soils along the middle reaches of the Huanghe, or Yellow River. With the introduction of iron about 600 BC, all this changed. Settlers from the north moved east into the Great Plain and south towards the heavily wooded Yangtze Basin, clearing and draining the land as they went. The Chu kings gradually extended their influence over the various domains, and the newly reclaimed lands were now brought directly under royal control, and the rents went straight to the exchequer, enabling the development of a sophisticated bureaucracy. The change was consolidated when, in 221 BC, the new dynasty, the Qin, unified all China and rebuilt and strengthened the Great Wall as a defensive barrier against the nomad tribes of the north. Today, China's Great Wall is about 1,500 miles long and stands at an average height of 30 feet. But Qin rule, harsh and exacting, promoted fierce reaction, and it was not until 202 BC that imperial rule was firmly re-established by the Han dynasty, who further extended the territories subject to imperial authority. Under the great Han Emperor Wu Ti, who ruled from 140 to 87 BC, China emerged as one of the great world powers. Its population continued to multiply until, by AD 2, when the first surviving census was taken, it amounted to no less than 57 million people, with the densest concentrations along the Yellow River plain. The period following the advent of iron witnessed great advances in government, even though many of the new empires which emerged after the long period of turbulence were harsh military authorities. Asoka, the unifier of India, had a standing army of 700,000 men, with 10,000 chariots and 9,000 elephants. The Persian king had a crack regiment of heavy infantry, the spearhead of his army, 10,000 men known as the Immortals, as seen in these glazed tiles from Persepolis. Cyrus, the founder of the Persian Empire, and later Darius, fought repeated campaigns against the raids of the skilled Scythian cavalry from the steppes north of the Black Sea. In China, Wu Ti conducted similar campaigns against the Xiongnu, and at the same time extended the Great Wall, which his Qin predecessors had constructed far to the west. The new measure of security which resulted made possible a rapid growth of trade. In the Central Asian kingdom of Persia, Darius created a great royal road which ran for more than 1,600 miles, from Susa, north of the Persian Gulf, to Sardis in Asia Minor, not far from the Aegean coast. In India, a similar royal highway ran all the way from the Ganges Delta to Taxila in the far northwest near the Khyber Pass, where it connected with caravan routes west to Persia and the Middle East and north to Central Asia. In China, the Han capital of Chang'an, a city of 250,000 inhabitants, lay at the center of an elaborate network of roads. All these works implied efficient government, a characteristic of the new empires. At Persepolis, Darius the Great of Persia reorganized the empire into 20 provinces with a comprehensive code of law, equitable taxes, and a stable currency. Here were all the basic elements of modern administration. Surveying the period as a whole, the decisive development is the emergence of great regional civilizations. The Qin and Han empires in China, the Mauryan Empire in India, and the empire founded by Cyrus in Persia spanned whole regions, between them almost the whole continent of Asia, from the Pacific Ocean in the east to the shores of the Aegean. With this expansion had come new techniques of government and new ways of administering the vast imperial territories. Only the West lagged behind, still on the outer margin of the civilized world. But almost at the moment when the first emperor of the Qin dynasty, Shu Huangti, united China in 221 BC, a new power was emerging in the West. In 241 BC, Rome, influenced by the earlier achievements of Greek civilization, embarked on the path of imperial expansion which, in the course of 2 centuries, would make it master of a vast Mediterranean empire and the equal of the great Han Empire in the east. Once again, the map of world history would be changing. Another act in the human drama was about to begin.